Robots Radio presents...
Hi there, and welcome to the Hidden Pixels podcast, a show highlighting those gaming stories you might have missed on your first playthrough. I'm your host, Sebastian Nazaro. On this episode, we're adventuring with Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Geralt is a witcher, a monster hunter for hire, and with a medieval fantasy setting, there are a lot of monsters to hunt. From werewolves to giant insects to ghouls, someone is always looking to hire Geralt's services. Today's story finds Geralt working with an old friend of his, Regis. Regis is a vampire, but one who is friendly to Geralt and doesn't quite pose a threat. Together they are searching for a very specific device that can only be found in an ancient vampire castle, Teshem Mutna. Let's dive in. Geralt of Rivia felt the rain patter against his broad, plated armor as he climbed the hill. He had left Regis days ago, but hoped that his vampire friend would already be waiting for him at the castle. He had known Regis for years, trusting that he would keep true to his word and wouldn't revert to a more baser instinct and attack. You see, there are two types of vampires in the world. The first is an instinctual creature covered in hair with long, razor-sharp claws. The other was like Regis, usually human in form and more intelligent than men on the whole. This type of higher vampire was extremely rare and could transform into their more common basic form on command. Higher vampires were some of the most dangerous creatures in the entire world. Geralt knew all of this as he wiped the dripping rain from his eyes. He was a witcher after all, a monster hunter trained to know each type of beast and creature. And even though all of his experience told him to not get involved in vampiric affairs, he trusted Regis. His friend had been abstaining from blood since a death-defying incident years past. In fact, it took a lot to trigger his former addiction. He had been nothing but friendly to Geralt in the years since the incident, and never attacked him, even when opportunity arose. Regis was waiting near the castle entrance when Geralt crested the hill. They were at Teshem Mutna, a former vampiric stronghold from years ago. It was the place of blood, of death, of suffering. From the little that Regis had told Geralt beforehand, it was not a place they wished to remain very long. Regis turned and gestured to the crumbling castle ruins behind him. "We have arrived. The sacrificial chamber of torture and torment lives underground." Geralt surveyed the dilapidated stone and overgrown brush. He wasn't exactly sure how they were going to get underground, but he trusted Regis with this excursion. "You lead." It was then when they noticed a giant dead rat on the ground. Geralt stooped down in the mud in order to better examine it. "Skeevers. Must be getting to their feeding ground." Regis looked unsurprised, haughtily looking away. "Correct. I told you there'd be danger." He then seemed distracted by something on the blank stone wall directly in front of them. It was centuries old, weather-worn and pebbling away in places. Regis put one hand up against the flat wall. "Behind this wall lies an ancient vampire dungeon." Geralt could sense the pain and suffering behind the wall. He could smell the dried blood. He didn't know the details of the location, but he could easily get the gist of it, and it unnerved him. "Seen a lot of things in my time. Nothing quite like this, though." Regis smirked and halfway turned his head back to the Witcher. "My, I feel honored. A man with such wealth of experience, yet I am about to show him something new." He turned back to the wall. "Now, to open it." And with a flick of his wrist, the flat stone started to lower into the ground, revealing a darkened stairway. The worn stairs led down under the ruins. While the rest of the site seemed to have been left alone for centuries, these stairs seemed to have somehow been maintained. Geralt stared in shock, not having sensed the mechanism or the doorway. "How the hell?" "It's an ancient form of protection against unwanted guests. The mechanism which releases the latch only reacts to a higher vampire's blood." Geralt was impressed, having never seen anything that could fully surpass his senses. Once again, he was reminded as to why higher vampires were some of the most dangerous creatures in the world. He tried not to let his surprise show as he lit a torch and began to descend down to the dungeon below. Tricky mechanisms, a vampire hideout, fortified, secured. Must have been important to your species once. He brushed aside root and dirt as they continued to delve lower and lower. Regis glanced over his shoulder as he responded, his face illuminated in the torchlight. It always shall be so. During the conjecture, the gate from our world into this one opened up in this land, and no other. This was the first place we saw. The staircase opened into a large stone room filled with boxes and armor. Geralt looked a few of the items over as they continued to talk. The next room they entered was yet another stairway spiraling down. In the gap in the middle of the room hung hundreds of cages, each with a human skeleton inside. Geralt pointed to one. This place, there's evil here. Death hangs in the air. Regis answered in a matter-of-fact way. Yes, a great many beings breathed their last here. They kept climbing down, eventually reaching a landing with 2 steel and wooden doors. Upon crossing into the next room, Geralt saw that they were in a long hallway lined with books and cages. Seems like your kind assembled a peculiar little library. Regis looked around as though for the first time. He had a look of slight disgust on his face. Indeed, though I personally did not lay a hand to it. As they walked along the hallway, Geralt couldn't stop himself from asking. Cells. Who for? Regis seemed ready for the question, although not fully comfortable with sharing all of the details. Disgraceful. Excruciatingly so, this particular page from our history. I'd rather not summon the demons from our past, if it's all right with you. Geralt waved a torch into the nearest cell, but it wasn't the bones on the ground that caught his attention. Rather, it was the markings etched into the stone wall that intrigued the Witcher. Glyphs are carved into the rock, coated with blood, used to be. They mean something? Regis barely looked at them, still wanting to leave as soon as possible. They're emblems, symbols of, what you would call tribes, dispersed throughout the world following the conjecture. My ancestors placed them here to remind us all of where we came from. Geralt motioned to the carving on the wall. And this one, which tribe is this? Regis looked quickly and closed his eyes. Garasham, my tribe and Detlef's. We both remained in this part of the world. He walked away from Geralt quickly and headed to the door at the end of the hallway. And of Kagmar, the reason we are in these ruins tonight. Regis only thought this last part to himself, for speaking the story of Kagmar was too chilling for this place. Even though the events of the story took place more than 1,000 years earlier, he could still feel the presence of those involved around him, like vultures circling above. Kagmar pulled the collar of his jacket up over his jowls, feeling the wind howl over the hillside and savoring it. He breathed deep, smelling the pulsing blood of the village below in the valley. The sensation was so strong, the pull so intense, that he could almost taste the living humans down there. The small village was home to maybe 50 or 60 people, a sizable feast for the vampire. But Kagmar wasn't supposed to attack humans anymore. At least not en masse like this. The leaders of his kind, the council, let him know how annoyed they were of his antics. He scoffed out loud on the hillside. Antics? How could they call his hunts antics? He was a predator. He had to feast. The sensations were just too great to ignore. He licked his lips, eyes not diverting from the village. Just one human. They wouldn't miss one human. He'd sneak down there, lure one away, and have his fix. No one would be the wiser, not the humans, not the council. It was decided. He would go down and grab just one and be done with it. No one would even know. Daniel, known affectionately as simply the boss, strode up to the front of the room. While the town had no official leader, he was the one who everyone seemed to look to for decisions. And with the recent string of disappearances, he was the one who called the meeting that night. The townsfolk were just trickling in, all silently nodding to the boss before sitting down. When most of the families were present, he began. So I know most of you are nervous about the people who have gone missing. Now we have to figure out what to do about them. A farmer in dirty trousers in the front row interrupted him. Well, what can we do? It was clearly the Batman who did it. There was some snickers from the back as the man brazenly continued. No, really! Wallace saw it himself, didn't you? A shy teenager stood up to the clear laughter spreading around the room. Well, yes, sir. I thought it was a bat. A very fat man jumped up in the back and hollered at Wallace. No, it wasn't, son. We all know it was a witch who had lured those out into the woods. There is no such thing as a Batman. Next thing you know, you'll be talking about men stronger than steel, or a woman with a magical lasso. The crowd erupted in laughter, and even the boss chuckled slightly as he waved for everybody to quiet down. All right, everybody. Settle down. The question isn't what is, the question is how are we going to prevent it from continuing? The room was silent as everyone looked around without an answer. The boss waited, but decided that he had to answer his own question. Well, I guess we'll have to have a hunt. We end the creature, whatever it is, and we'll be rid of it forever. Everyone nodded in agreement, murmuring their support of the boss's plan. He was the boss for a reason, after all. But before he could get into details, the doors of the meeting hall burst open. A young boy, maybe 6 or 7, came stumbling in. He was dirty and had large, deep red stains splotching his clothes. His eyes were puffed and teary, and while he seemed unharmed, he was clearly traumatized. The townsfolk closest to him stood up, but he waved them off and cried out, The Batman! In the valley! In the village! In the valley! The Batman killed them! And with that, he fainted on the spot. Kagmar woke slowly under a large oak tree on the hill, the same hill on which he stood the night before. His head was fogged and aching, and he was woozy as he lifted himself onto an elbow. It was morning, much later than he usually awoke. The shade of the tree had shifted, and the shining light of the clear morning poured down on him. He blinked in the sunshine, and heard only birds chirping in the tree. Minutes passed, and soon Kagmar could rise into a sitting position. As he sat up, he noticed more and more. The crusted, stained splotches on his clothes, the sweet taste of rich blood still on his lips and tongue, and most noticeably, the lack of noise from the village in the valley below. Kagmar looked down in the direction of the village, but couldn't see any people from this high up. He wouldn't have seen them anyway, not after what he did last night. He groaned as he stood up, remembering more and more in the daylight. He was only going to take one measly human, one person to satiate his burning need for blood. He remembered clearly now, transforming into bat form, a huge creature the size of a man, but with his intellect intact. He remembered seeing the farmhand round the corner towards the barn, alone in person and in society. He remembered swooping down and the first bite of the man. But he was careless. The man apparently had taken a lover for the night, a curious lover who had followed him around the corner and witnessed Kagmar's attack. A woman who was the vampire's next victim when the farmhand wasn't nearly enough. And after the woman, it was an elderly couple next door, and then the town guard, and then mothers and fathers and sons and daughters. Kagmar ripped through the village like a knife through butter. He wasn't sure if he got them all. 1 or 2 of the villagers who lived on the outskirts may have escaped. Kagmar sighed while still looking down at the village. Well, nothing he can do about it now. He was satisfied at the moment, and happy. He knew the council would be upset, angry even. But how could they expect him to resist when they were a species of hunters? They had to understand. Maybe they were even a little jealous, bound by the rules they set upon themselves, considering themselves higher beings. Nonetheless, Kagmar knew he would get a talking to, maybe even a light punishment. It was worth it, just to keep feeding, just to get that nectar into his system, just to feel alive through the feast. The townsfolk were scared, but they knew what they needed to do. The boss had thought it through all night, and there was no way around it. They had to hunt the Batman. Ever since that child came running into the town meeting, convinced of what he saw, the story of the Batman spread like wildfire. And since the story of a traumatized 6-year-old was as good a proof as any, it was decided that the Batman was real and dangerous. The boss took the men of the town over to the Valley Village the next morning. It was eerily quiet, but the evidence was all around. Bloodstains and mangled corpses were strewn waywardly around town. There were no survivors and very few signs of a fight. What they were hunting was large and dangerous. It was Gregor who found the blood trail and footprints. It seemed as though the creature hulked back up the hill overlooking the valley. The men all climbed up, the morning sun quickly reaching noon and scorching their boiled leather armor. What they found was where the beast had camped for the night, and more footprints heading off into the woods. The group of men hesitated, but the boss knew that they needed to see it through. He was the first to start off toward the wood, and reluctantly the men followed. It was much more difficult tracking the beast through the undergrowth and brush, but the boss had some experience tracking wild animals. Soon he was well ahead of his men and could barely hear them struggling to get through the bramble behind him. Before he stopped to wait for him, though, he heard something ahead. He crept low, coming upon an open clearing in the middle of the wood. There stood a group of men, all well-dressed and wholly out of place in the forest. They were in a sort of circle around another man, who was bound on his knees and slightly disheveled. As the boss's eyes adjusted to the light flickering through the canopy of leaves over the clearing, he noticed the bloodstains covering the man's clothes. The boss raised his gun, not knowing if this man was a survivor or the murderer himself. He could hear voices now, and there was some sort of argument happening. One of the men in the circle stepped forward. "Yes, but we told you not to do it, Kagmar. We told you it would start trouble, but you just couldn't help yourself, could you? It is truly disgusting." The bound man, who must have been Kagmar, spat at the man's feet. "How can you deny our kind, our right to rule over these lesser creatures? They are nothing but cows, cattle for our slaughtering consumption." The man standing in front of Kagmar interrupted. "But now they are mosquitoes, buzzing in our ears. You rustled their nests, and now the nuisance is too much. The other villagers are rounding up to hunt us. One village actually hired mages to assist. Another is already at the edge of this wood. No, Kagmar, you cannot be left to your own devices anymore." Kagmar rolled his eyes and straightened up a little. "All right. Lecture me and slap my wrists. We all know you won't take real action, not against one of our own kind." The man in front narrowed his eyes and leaned into Kagmar even closer. "Well, that is where you are sorely mistaken, my old friend." And with that, he grabbed the fellow vampire's arm and disappeared. The others in the circle quickly followed, vanishing in an instant. The boss took a beat, not believing what he just witnessed. He stood up, slowly entering the circle. As he continued to stare at the place where Kagmar knelt, he knew that their problems were much worse than a single Batman. The council was furious. Kagmar hadn't counted on that. They had him bound and watched him for 3 days now while they prepared something in the chamber down below. He was locked in Teshem Mutna, the home of his people. A lovely castle, but Kagmar never really liked being within its walls. He much preferred the outdoors, the open air, and the hunt. 3 days without blood. It was the longest time that he had gone without that he could remember, and his memory spanned centuries. He started off strong, defying the council of seeing him suffer. But the withdrawal was becoming too much. He slowly degraded, spending the last 12 hours huddled in a corner. He was there when he heard the guards approach. They opened his cage and roughly dragged him to whatever they were preparing in the chamber below. It was much darker down here, and he could barely make out the shapes of empty cages hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a group of vampires standing around a large object. He couldn't see what it was past their bodies, but he knew it wasn't going to end well for him. For some reason, being dragged unwillingly down into a darkened vampire torture chamber didn't sit well with him. In the torchlight, Kagmar could see the grim faces of all the council members. Representatives of all 3 tribes were present, which was surprising due to the lack of communication in recent years. That's when it truly hit him that he was not going to be let off with just a slap on the wrist. One of the council members stepped forward, speaking with authority. "Kagmar, the council has decided you cannot break your addiction and you are an endangerment to the rest of our kind. You weaklings! You weak, pathetic creatures! You really think humans are a threat to our existence? You truly believe that we should be concerned at all about their cares? They are nothing! Mosquitoes buzzing around!" The leader's eyes narrowed. Yes, but you stirred the mosquito's nest, and they are annoyingly buzzing by our heads, nicking at our skin. And while we could simply crush them, we'd rather consider the source instead. You, Kagmar, have been left unchecked long enough, and now you must be held responsible for your actions. Bring him forward." The guards dragged him towards the center of the room, and the council parted to make a path. Kagmar could now clearly see the previously obscured object. Another cage. A cage unlike any other. Kagmar could sense it. He would not be able to escape this one. The material and powers that held the cage together could hold him here forever. Kagmar's panic increased. "Cowards! You refuse to see what's in front of you!" The guards forced Kagmar into the cage, clasping his hands into the cuffs embedded in the metal siding. With a roar, Kagmar transformed into his beast-like lower state, his claws scratching the metal, but it was no use. He was trapped. "Let me out!" But the council was already raising the cage high into the air, far above the ground. Kagmar was panting, expecting them to leave him here in the dark, but the council was unmoving, staring up at him. There was a brief pause of confusion until he sensed it. Humans. Living humans. Here in Teshemutna. He could feel the blood pulsing through their bodies, taste the sweet life-giving liquid. He needed it. He needed to escape. Predictably, more guards ushered in a group of 8 humans, some men, some women, all terrified. They were arranged in a line in front of the council, trembling nervously. Kagmar was mad with desire, screaming and shaking his cage high above. Suddenly, the council leader gave a nod to the guards. They strode to the humans, clawed hands at the ready, and gashed each one on the arm. The humans cried out in pain, some falling to their knees as they each grasped their bloody wounds. While not enough to kill or even seriously injure them, the blood still seeped through their fingers and stained their clothes. Kagmar was driven into a craze, unable to escape or satiate his bloodlust. He watched helplessly as each of the humans were stored into their own separate cages, crying and pleading while rising up to the same level as Kagmar. The blood was so close, and yet unavailable to him. He was blind with desire, trapped in his obsession. It was the ultimate form of torture. When the council had finished lifting the human cages, they left without another word. Every day, they would reopen the human wounds, replacing those who died and never letting Kagmar feast. Day after day of constant madness, constant craze. For 200 years this went on, driving Kagmar insane in his thirst. The room eventually became known as the place of execution, not because of all the humans who perished there, but from Kagmar and his torturous demise. And for this, Teshemutna would forever be stained with death. Hundreds of years later, Geralt could feel this stain as he walked the halls of the ruined castle. He followed Regis down one last set of stairs and into a huge round chamber. High above him, more cages hung from the ceiling. Rusted and ancient, he was confused as to their purpose. In front of them on the ground, there rested one single cage made of a different material. Geralt was confused. Charming place, but what are all the cages for? Mentioned only one vampire being kept here. Regis sighed and looked down. Well, yes, you see, humanitarians is something my ancestors were not. Today's story is one of thousands spread throughout The Witcher 3 and its 2 follow-on expansions. It's the rare game that takes a mundane task, such as investigating a missing shipment or speaking to someone down at the docks, and turning it into a whirlwind adventure far from the main storyline. All of these side quests encourage the player to scour the map and to speak to everyone in the game. Exploration is key, leading to some amazing storytelling. So yeah, pretty much right in the Hidden Pixels wheelhouse. This story stems off from the main quest in the game's second expansion, entitled Blood and Wine. As you can guess, this expansion is all about the higher vampires, but hints of Kagmar and his torture grabbed my attention. There are a bunch of books and notes in Tesha Mutna in the game explaining the experiments vampires performed on humanity. And they also explain a little bit of Kagmar's story, capture, and eventual torture. We also included our patron Dan the Boss Artegis into the story as the townfolk's courageous leader. So thank you so much for your support, boss, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. The boss graciously supports the show at the Tested Traveler level on our Patreon. And if you decided to do the same, you'll also get a character named after you. There are a bunch of other tiers, as little as $1 or $3 a month, and that's basically just buying me a cup of coffee each month and getting 4 or 5 episodes in return. So please consider supporting at patreon.com/hiddenpixelspodcast. I also wanted to do something that's been a long time coming. If supporting the show financially isn't possible or something you're interested in, which I totally respect and appreciate, consider rating and reviewing the show on iTunes. It provides a huge boost to the expanding the show's reach and allowing others to see and experience it. I want to go back and give a big thank you to Brady NT, Gaffer 177297004, Matty O 8907, Brooklyn Q, Maddie Nice, Margie Newman 4, Torbell, Hman 0916, Manny 3G, and Tino Max for submitting those original group of reviews. And a special shout out to Brandroid, Urban Myth 61, Ken 4656, and Lord Marksman for the reviews over the past couple weeks. You have all said some amazing things about the show, and it really makes me happy to see how much you're enjoying the stories. Thank you. Next episode, we're doing our first ever second visit to a game series. We're going back to where Hidden Pixels started, the Fallout universe. So come back in 2 weeks, and thank you so much for listening. This episode of the Hidden Pixels podcast was written, recorded, and produced by me, Sebastian Azaro. All episode music information can be found in the show notes or on our website, hiddenpixelspodcast.com. If you like what you heard, please consider showing your support on our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenpixelspodcast. Every bit helps to continue to share these hidden stories. And if you like what you heard, or even if you didn't, please rate and review the show on any major podcast streaming platform. And find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as Hidden Pixels Podcast, or on our Discord channel where we're continuing the stories after the story. Links to all are in our show notes as well. And as always, thanks for listening.
Have you ever wondered how deep the Elder Scrolls lore rabbit hole goes? Have you got a grasp of the basics and want to find out more about the universe? Written in Uncertainty is here to help you. We'll be mixing in philosophy, theology, and whatever other theory is useful with Elder Scrolls texts to untangle some of the biggest questions in the series, like what are dragon breaks, how does Chim work, where did the Dwemer go, and more. Check us out at writteninuncertainty.com or find Written in Uncertainty on any podcatcher. Thanks for listening, and catch you later in the grey maybe of Tamriel.